Once we hit update 38, the Necrom chapter, there will be 549 unique gear sets in ESO. This includes all the different types of sets such as 5-piece, mythics, monster sets, etc. This can be a bit daunting to sift through, not just for new players, but also for veterans as well. So hopefully I can make that process a little easier on you. So this will be my comprehensive guide to all of the top DPS sets in the Elder Scrolls Online. I do have my tier lists updated for Necrom. These are on my website at skinnycheeks.gg if you ever need to reference them. Now, I won't be going through all of the sets that are here on the tier list, but instead for this video, I'll be breaking them down into the following sections. So we'll start with great sets that you can grab really early on. These are either craftable or purchasable from the guild traders. So these will get you started with great damage, could just be temporary to wear while you farm for other sets, though some of these will last you all the way into the end game. Then after that, I'll go through the top sets for builds that are focused on dealing heavy attack damage. Then I'll cover the top support sets that are commonly worn on a damage dealer. In optimized group play, there are simply too many support sets to have only the tanks and the healers wear them. So these are the most common ones you might end up running as a damage dealer. Next, I'll go through what I think are the 10 best 5-piece sets overall for damage. So if I was starting a new account today, these would be my top priority to make sure that I end up collecting. And then I'll go through the top mythics that you'll want to gather through the antiquity system. These are powerful 1-piece items that you can only wear one of at a time. And then finally, I'll end the video with the top ability altering weapons. These are special weapons that will augment specific abilities from the weapon skill lines such as destruction staff, bow, dual wield, etc. Now, you might have noticed I did not mention monster sets. I actually will not be covering those in this video because, well, not much has changed at all since my last video covering them, and it seems a bit redundant to rehash almost all of the same information over again when I already did a pretty thorough guide on that. So I'll just recommend you check out that video if you are interested in the top monster sets for DPS. I'll have it linked at the top of the description below. Real quick though, while we are on the topic, the couple of changes since that video. For Selene, the 1-piece bonus was changed to weapon and spell damage instead of max stamina. So this is a little bit stronger now. Not only is weapon and spell damage better than max resource, but it's also better for a larger variety of builds since Magicka-based users can now equally benefit from this. And then we have the Archdruid Deveric monster set. I didn't cover this one in that video as this is a support set, but it is sometimes run on a support DPS, so this could be a nice one to have for your group. But that's pretty much it, so you can see why it didn't really make sense to do a whole new video covering monster sets for just those small updates. One of the great things about starting your gear collection in ESO is that the difference is pretty small between the early sets and the end game sets, and often there is even overlap. Some sets you grab right out of the gate are best in slot for certain classes or situations. See, gear progression in ESO is not very vertical, but instead it is designed horizontally. So what do I mean by that? There are definitely sets that are more powerful than others, not to say that the vertical aspect doesn't exist, but typically gear is designed in a way where different options are going to get you the best results for different situations. So there may be some sets that can do everything pretty well, but when you're really looking for the best option, that will typically vary from encounter to encounter. So it's really common for newer players to ask me to just give them the best setup for damage, and it doesn't really work that way in ESO. You can almost think of it like having a toolkit. Once I've collected a lot of different sets, I have my character's inventory and bank space taken up by a lot of different tools, and then once I've gotten a good feel for a particular encounter in the game, then I can start figuring out which tools would be best for that job if I really want to min-max it. Now that doesn't mean you have to, especially on normal difficulty or even veteran non-hard mode content. You can have quite a bit of flexibility to set up however you want without really worrying about all that. But at the same time, if you really want to push things, there is a lot of room for min-maxing. So why do I say all this? Well, I want to set up the expectations for getting these sets that I'll be going through. In most cases, it won't just be wear this until you get the next set and then dump the last one like it is in some MMOs. There really isn't a pinnacle gear setup to go for, but we do all have to start somewhere when it comes to collecting gear. So here are some of the best 5-piece sets that you can grab early on, either craftable options or sets you can purchase with gold off of the guild traders. So I'll start out with what I think is the best overall craftable set for DPS, the most universal one, and that is Order's Wrath, which comes from High Isle. This set just has really solid stat lines all throughout, and crit chance and crit damage are some of the strongest offensive stats to have for DPS. Since this is craftable, you also have a lot of flexibility. You can make it in light or medium armor, whichever route you're going. Really, the main downside is that crit damage is capped at 125% additional damage, so part of that 5-piece can end up wasted once you start pushing into more optimized group play, but for the majority of situations, you won't really need to worry about that. Next up, I'll stick with craftable sets here. We have Heartland Conqueror. This one comes from Blackwood. It's not as good for damage as something like Order's Wrath. However, it does have a very unique 5-piece bonus in that it doubles the effectiveness of your weapon traits. So for those that are in more of a rush to level their champion points or maybe level a new character, you can use the training trait on your weapons, and this will double the value of that trait. It isn't a huge XP benefit, but depending on what kind of content you're working on, you don't always really need to have a ton of damage to quickly fly through it, and that extra XP could be more worth it to you. So this is definitely a good option if you want to level up a little quicker, but you can skip over it if you're not in any rush. And then finally, the last craftable set we'll talk about is the brand new one with the Necrom chapter, and this is Shattered Fate. The premise for this is a little bit different from what we normally have with crafted sets. You can craft this as a 5-piece, a 10-piece, or a 12-piece set. I did a little breakdown when I initially covered the introduction of this, and so if you view it as traditional set bonuses broken up, it would look more like this. So as you can see, very solid stats all around, especially for just starting out. Now this won't be one of those sets that you'll want to continue to wear into really optimized group play later on, as it will generally be outclassed by some of the more traditional set combinations you can wear. But for just doing some more unoptimized stuff like running random dungeons, the stats on this set are actually really solid, and you can't beat how easy it is to put together. So whether you're setting up an alternate character with some gear that you don't play as often, or maybe you are a newer player and don't have any sets put together yet, this is just a really simple solution for good damage. All right, next up, we'll look at a couple of Overland sets that are really nice starter options. So the good thing about Overland sets, these are the ones that drop in the main zones of the game. You can farm these, but since they are bind on equip and not bind on pickup, this means that other players will be selling these, and you can save yourself some time by just purchasing the pieces off of a guild trader. So here we have Mother's Sorrow and War Maiden. Mother's Sorrow is from Deshawn. This is a bit more universal and just gives a bunch of crit chance. There's also a stamina equivalent of this set called Leviathan. It's a medium armor set. It comes from a pretty easy base game dungeon, Crypt of Hearts, but you will have to farm those pieces since dungeon drops are bind on pickup. But really solid stats here with these. It won't be used a ton in in-game, but definitely a nice starting point to deal good damage. And then we have War Maiden. This comes from Vardenfell. It is a bit more niche and really only for classes that have a large percentage of their damage classified as magic damage. So Magicka Templars, Nightblades, and Arcanists should find this to be a really nice starter option for them. Similar to Mother's Sorrow, it will end up outclassed later on by some other options you can grab, but definitely a strong one to pick up early, especially if you can find some cheap pieces of it. But moving on to the final section of the easy to get early sets, these are some sets that are not only really nice to have early on, but also continue to be some of the best options during endgame. First, we have Deadly Strike. This is a set that you can purchase in Cyrodiil with alliance points, or you can also buy it off of a guild trader with gold. It is very expensive for good pieces of this set, and that is because it is one of the best sets that you can run on a Templar. It synergizes extremely well with their kit, not only boosting their damage over time abilities, but also their main spammable puncturing strikes in its morphs, but it doesn't even stop there. It also boosts their really strong execute ability, Radiant Destruction in its morphs. So just a really, really great set to run on a Templar. And now with the introduction of the Arcanist, we have another class that this is really strong on. So I'll be using Deadly Strike for a ton of different encounters on the Arcanist. It has amazing synergy with their Fate Carver beam, especially for AoE heavy situations. So this works both as an always active set, but also great as a front bar only set, since the majority of what we're boosting is going to be happening while you're on the front bar. I know some have asked if the back bar dots will be increased if this is only active on the front bar, and it will. As long as you're on the front bar, every dot you have going will be boosted by this. So try to pick this one up now if you do want it, because I have a feeling the prices are only going to go up with the Arcanist coming out. Next up, we have Briarheart. This one comes from Hrothgar. It's a medium set. And this one is not nearly as common in endgame as Deadly Strike. However, it is a really good burst set since you get that 450 weapon and spell damage for 10 seconds before it falls off. This is a little bit lower than the popular Magicka set Burning Spellweave. However, if you are running a stamina build instead of a Magicka one, that stamina line will be a bit more useful to you and offset that 40 less weapon and spell damage. So for lower health or trash stuff that you're just trying to kill kill super quickly, this can be a really nice option for that. And similar to Burning Spellwave, you have the flexibility to run this as either a back bar set or a front bar set for burst scenarios. There's also a heal on Briarheart. It can be decent if you have enough dots ticking, but nothing that's going to be too crazy. For non-burst scenarios, just using it as a standard set for longer enemy encounters, this one really isn't anything too crazy damage-wise. I definitely wouldn't say it's bad, but it will be outclassed by quite a few other sets. And then finally, we have a medium set from Western Skyrim. This is Venomous Smite. I think this set is a bit slept on compared to some of the other options that do get used a little more often. The proc damage is okay on this set. It's not going to be quite as strong as some of the more common options out there, but the size on this set is really nice with the 6-meter radius that centers on the target that it triggers on, and the 2 to 4 piece bonuses are also really good. So I've seen some really nice parses using this set, and I definitely think there are some encounters that it works really well on. Very useful as a two-handed back bar set since it has a 15-second cooldown on it and it triggers off of crits. Well, Stampede lasts for 15 seconds and is a guaranteed crit every time you cast it, so that can make it line up really well and make this set super easy to trigger on your back bar. But if you wanted to run it as a front bar set, you could also do that and it would work well. It does run into the issue that some other sets in the game like Stormfist and Pillar of Nirn run into, where it can trigger on an undesired target, so just keep that in mind when you're planning around it. At the end of the day, it is an Overland set that doesn't require any farming, and you could just grab the pieces you want off of a guild trader, so even if you don't continue to use it later on, it could be a nice one to grab in the meantime while you work on collecting other sets. Now, those certainly aren't the only options you can go with early on. I even have some others listed here on the tier list, but those are the ones that I think are probably the most relevant that you can get without stepping foot into a dungeon or a trial. Next up, we'll cover a few sets that are going to be the best options if you're doing a heavy attack build. First up, we have Sergeant's Mail. This one comes from an early, easy base game dungeon, Wayrest Sewers, and it's kind of the cornerstone set for all of these types of heavy attack setups. You'll want to run this on your lightning staff, 2 jewelry pieces, and a heavy chest piece to make sure that you have as few pieces on the body as possible since it is a heavy set. But ideally, the one piece on the body will be the chest since that benefits the most as far as resistances go from being heavy armor. Now for our options to pair with sergeants, we have quite a few that are really nice depending on your situation. Stormmaster is a great medium armor option to use. This one is again from one of the earlier easy base game dungeons, Tempest Island. Stormmaster will be nice for more optimized encounters where you don't need the penetration from light armor. So this would be applicable for practicing on the trial dummy since Alkosh is present there to remove 6k armor from the Iron Atronach dummy. If you do need that penetration though, Noble Duelist Silks is going to be a great option to run. This also comes from a base game dungeon, Blessed Crucible. This one is really easy to keep up and has a very large bonus for your heavy attacks. Another really nice light armor set that you might consider using is one that drops in the Craglorn trials, and that is Infallible Mage, also called Infallible Aether. If you just compare the heavy attack bonus, this is a little worse than some of the options we've already gone through. However, if you're not running Oaken Soul, the 3-piece Minor Slayer bonus on this can be really strong to have. And also, if you're running solo or not in an optimized group, the minor vulnerability that is applied could also come in handy too. In even semi-organized groups though, this bonus will be redundant, so that's why you don't see this one more commonly used, and also usually Oaken Soul is used with heavy attack builds, so that 3-piece Minor Slayer is also redundant. But I definitely wanted to mention this one still because all of the stat line bonuses are very good on this set, so if you end up needing the Minor Slayer and the minor vulnerability, this is a really good one to have. And then finally we have Undaunted Infiltrator and Undaunted Unweaver. I think all of the previously listed sets kind of fill in the gaps that we need for heavy attack builds, but these two can also work really well. Infiltrator is a medium armor set, which could be really nice if you're stacking into stamina with the heavy attack build since it has those 2 stamina lines. You don't see this as commonly as stacking into Magicka, but it's something that you can do and you'll have a lot of stamina to play with, and those 2 stamina lines would synergize really well with doing that, and the condition of casting a Magicka ability is super easy to keep up. And then Undaunted Unweaver is another light armor set, kind of the reverse of Infiltrator. You'll need to have a stamina costing ability though in order to keep this up. So just something to keep in mind if you're using this one. And the last thing to mention about the heavy attack builds, you could also pair sergeants with some of your more traditional build sets like Pillar of Nirn or Reliquin, and these work really well too, especially for single target damage. If you are really going for that AoE damage, the sets that directly boost your heavy attacks can be really nice paired with those lightning heavies though. All right, next up, we'll go through the top support sets that you might consider running as a damage dealer. First up is Elemental Catalyst. This is a light set from the Stone Garden DLC dungeon. This one is very popular to have on a DPS for group play, and that's because with this set, you can give everyone in the group 15% extra crit damage as long as you are damaging the enemy with a Flame, Shock, and Frost skill every 3 seconds. Each of these adds 5% crit damage taken to the target, so even as a selfish buff, 15% crit damage is really nice, but when you consider that the whole group can benefit, it's pretty much a no-brainer to have this one going. A couple of key things to consider when running this: it does have to be an actual skill that you are using to proc these elements. You can't rely on enchantments, and the damage from your pets does not work either. So on a Necromancer, for example, the flame portion of this set will not trigger from a flame enchantment, and it will not trigger from your blast bones. So it is important to keep those rules in mind when you set up for this. It is most commonly run on a Necromancer though, since they have their shock damage covered with Mystic Siphon, their frost damage covered with their Boneyard, and then you can use either the Flame Wall of Elements or the Scalding Rune skill in the Mage's Guild line to proc the fire portion of this. I do see a lot of people ask if this set can be front barred only or if it needs to be always active, and I'd say if you are a bit more experienced, you can definitely keep it up front bar only. Those 3-second windows are long enough to handle that, but if you are newer and just want to make sure you're providing good uptimes for your group while you figure things out, it may be better to have it as an always active set. But it definitely does not work as a back bar only set. Next up, we have Roar of Alkosh. This is a medium trial set from Maw of Lorkhaj. The 5-piece bonus on this is really nice. Every time you take a synergy, you hit all the enemies in front of you with a shockwave that deals a small amount of damage, but also lowers their armor by 6k as long as you have 6k or more weapon damage. And this is pretty easy to hit nowadays in dungeons and trials. This is mainly just a condition that makes it a bit out of reach to get the full benefit from on a traditional support role, and it's much easier to max that out on a damage dealer. Now, this can be a little bit tricky to keep up. It lasts for 10 seconds, but synergies do have a cooldown of 20 seconds per individual synergy. So you definitely need a steady flow of synergies coming through if you want to max out your uptime on this. However, there are a couple of unique synergies that can really help you out. One is from the Undaunted Orb. Either morph works there, and also the Purify synergy that you get from the Templar's Ritual ability. Now, what makes these unique is that the synergies do not go away whenever a teammate triggers them. Everyone has access to press them once every 20 seconds as long as the ability is active. So what you can do as the Alkosh wearer is stagger these two. You can take one and then wait 10 seconds to take the next one, and then after that 10 seconds goes by, the original one will be available again. This makes it so much easier to make sure that you always have a synergy ready to go whenever Alkosh is about to run out. Now, all of the other synergies that are coming out, you can definitely still take those two in between, and that gives you even more wiggle room with the timing, but it's nice to save the Purify and the Orb synergy to make sure that you always have something to hit. When your group is all building around this 6k armor debuff being there, if you don't have it up, that's going to be a huge DPS loss. So that's why it's nice to make sure that you're really proactive about keeping these synergies going. Definitely something to consider when planning around this set. All right, next up we have Zin's Redress. This is a light armor set from Lair of Marsalok. The way that this set functions is pretty straightforward. You only need to light attack to apply the Touch of Zen debuff on an enemy, and then it's on them for 20 seconds. It's pretty much the easiest debuff set to run. And then while that debuff is active, any sticky dot you put on the enemy will add a 1% damage taken debuff to them, and that stacks up to 5% max. So everyone will hit that enemy 5% harder as long as you have 5 dots applied to them. Now, I mentioned dots that stick to the target because ground dots like Wall of Elements or something like Deadly Cloak that sticks to you, these do not count towards the stacks on that. It has to be something like Degeneration or Poison Injection, something where the ability is directly applied and ticks on the target, and these are the type of skills that will work for this. So Dragon Knight is a really popular choice for running this as they naturally have a lot of abilities in their kit that work. So essentially you don't really need to change up your build or play any differently on a Dragon Knight, and you can keep this set up easily. They definitely aren't the only class that it can be run on. It's just usually the default because of how well it works with their kit. It's also worth noting that hemorrhaging, burning, and poisoned are considered damage over time effects and do count for the percent boosts. So you can usually get by just fine only having 4 actual sticky abilities for most builds, and then let the uptimes from those take care of the rest. Lastly, since the debuff for this is applied to the enemy, triggered from a light attack, and has a long duration, there is a lot of flexibility in how you can set it up. You can easily run it only on the front bar or only on the back bar and shouldn't have any issues with uptimes. Moving on, we have War Machine and Master Architect. These are medium and light armor sets from the trial Halls of Fabrication, and I'm including them together here because they have the same 5-piece function. One of the sets is just medium with the stamina line, and the other is light with the magicka line. So depending on your build, you may prefer one or the other. These are pretty great as they give Major Slayer to you and your 5 closest teammates for 1 second for every 10 ultimates spent whenever you cast your ultimate. So if you save all the way up to 500 ult, that would be 50 seconds worth of Major Slayer. Now, since it only goes to 6 people, you do generally want 2 people in this for a trial if you're using it. And then you want to make sure that the stacks are split up 6 and 6 so that when the ultimates go out, it is split up evenly to hit everyone. Now, you might say, well, this is redundant if you have a healer doing Roaring Opportunist and Yorvold's Guidance together, commonly referred to as the Rojo setup. And yes, that is a great option for most encounters. Generally, over the course of a longer fight, the uptimes from that will be a bit higher and more consistent. However, for shorter encounters and some encounters because of the way that they end up playing out, the long duration that you can get from these sets, plus getting a lot of ultimate back from pillagers after the initial casts, well, essentially you're going to keep this buff up for a while longer in the opening period before it falls off versus using something like Roaring Opportunist and Yorvold's Guidance together. So both setups definitely have their places. War Machine and Master Architect can be very powerful though when used correctly. Next up, we have Martial Knowledge. This is a light armor set from Craglorn. While your stamina is below 50%, your light attacks cause the enemy to take 8% additional damage for 5 seconds. This effect can occur once every 8 seconds. So if you did somehow manage a perfect uptime on this, you'd be getting about a 5% damage increase for everyone in your group, similar to Zen's Redress. This is the most difficult DPS support set to manage though because of that 50% stamina condition. While it's not anything too crazy, especially on a stamina build, if you do overcompensate with trying to keep your stamina low for it, you could run yourself out of resources and not have enough to properly deal with mechanics that require you to block or roll dodge. And then sometimes your stamina sustain is too good, and well, you have to find that right balance to make sure that you're comfortably sitting in the correct threshold to trigger this. Coral Riptide is a nice set to pair with this, is you'll already be meeting that low stamina condition for Martial Knowledge, so you should be getting a lot of value out of the Coral 5-piece bonus. I'll often recommend groups to not worry about Martial Knowledge too much whenever you're first learning a piece of content, and then once you get a little more comfortable with the mechanics, maybe consider introducing this to add another little mini game for the wearer and a nice damage buff for the team. It is definitely a good one to have, but I'd say it is the support set that I don't feel obligated to assign if no one is comfortable with this type of playstyle. However, if you are score pushing or really trying to max out DPS for certain time requirements, this one is one you're going to want to make sure that you have going. And then the last set I wanted to mention in the support section is Morag Tong. This one isn't super popular in your standard group compositions, but if your group is set up with a lot of bow users, this can be a very nice group-wide DPS boost. Just a flat 10% to all poison abilities is pretty nice to have when bows have so much poison damage in their kits, but outside of this sort of scenario, not really worth giving up a 5-piece set bonus to slot this one. All right, for the next section of this video, I'll be going through what I think are the top 10 full 5-piece sets overall for damage. Now, this won't be every good option, but essentially how I'm looking at this is if I had a new account getting into dungeons and trials today, which sets would be my top priority to pick up if I had to narrow it down to just 10? And also, these are not ranked in any particular order. I think they all can be the best for different situations. So first up, I have to bring up Deadly Strike. I won't go in depth here again, as we already talked about this set earlier in the video in the easy to get set section, but Deadly Strike is just so good for Arcanists and Templars, it has to be in my top 10. Next is Arms of Reliquin. This is a medium set from Cloudrest. This is the #1 set for single target damage. It applies a dot that you can increase up to 10 stacks, and this dot will tick on its own, but it also ticks when you land your light attacks. So great light attack weaving will make sure that you're getting the most damage possible from this set. So for encounters where you're really focusing on one target and that's the priority, and the stacks from this can be kept up reliably, it is the best option to go with. Having the perfected version just gives you a little bit extra stamina, which is nice to have, but definitely not going to make or break your setup if you have not gotten that perfected version yet. It's also worth noting that this set does scale with weapon and spell damage, but it cannot critically strike. It doesn't really matter too much, it still hits insanely hard, but something to keep in mind. Next up is Sul'San's Torment. This is another medium trial set, this one from Rockgrove. When an enemy you recently damaged dies, they leave behind a Vengeful Soul for 6 seconds. Touching the soul increases your crit chance by 2160 and your critical damage by 12% for 30 seconds. So nearly 10% crit chance and 12% crit damage from the 5-piece bonus here. That makes this an absolute monster of a 5-piece bonus. Now the kicker is that it does rely on enemies dying and that happening at least every 30 seconds for you to be able to keep the 5-piece bonus up. So this is why you commonly see this used as an AoE trash set, since there will be tons of bodies. However, this is not limited only to trash. If there is a boss encounter that also meets these conditions, you can get really good results with this there as well. Overall, Sul'San's Torment is one of my favorite sets in the game, and really I try to use it wherever possible. Next up, we have Pillar of Nirn. This is a medium dungeon set from Falkreath Hold. It deals a bunch of bleed damage to the target. It's just a really nice and easy set to use. The damage from the proc is really strong, and since it triggers from any damage, you have the flexibility to pretty much run it however you want as a front bar set, a back bar set, or an always active set. It can kind of slide into any setup that way. The main downsides to it are the small AoE size, 2.5 meters, really makes this more of a single target oriented set, even though it is technically an AoE, and also stuff that has a lot of quick movement. There is a chance that the proc can miss since there is that small delay period from when it procs to when it lands. This is usually not an issue, but it can be for some really mobile bosses. Overall, one of the best sets in the game for boss encounters where the priority is single target damage. Next up, we have Azurblight Reaper. This is a medium set from Lair of Marsalok. This is another one of my favorite sets, an absolute monster in AoE fights. Since the stacks can build up off of any dots, including your AoE dots, well, the more enemies that are around, the more this is going to be blowing up on everything in the area. You usually only want one person wearing this set since it acts as a debuff on the enemies that it hits, and then that cooldown period between stacks building will be shared with everyone. However, with more than one person wearing it, you do get the burst sooner, since both wearers' dots will be stacking it up. So in some scenarios, you actually might prefer to have a second person in this. If there are enough enemies and the cost of dipping into what one person would get out of this set is less, then the benefit that the second person wearing it is getting over wearing something different. In Reef Guardian hard mode, for example, sometimes you'll see two people wearing this set as they can both still get really good damage from it due to the high number of targets consistently available. If you do have enough dots going, this can be pretty good on fights even as low as 2 priority targets, as long as they are close enough to share the explosions, but you definitely only want one person in it for that type of scenario. Overall, it's a really interesting and unique set. It's really strong and worth it to have going in your group, and I think the balance for it lies in that it cannot be effectively used by everyone in the group at the same time. Next up, we have Whirl of the Depths. This is a light armor set from the Dreadsail Reef Trial. So this is a proc set that deals frost damage, and the damage from this set is really backloaded. The single target dot it applies initially barely tickles at all, but the AoE it drops when that portion is done hits incredibly hard. So as long as you're reliably getting that AoE that drops to hit the desired enemy, this is a very strong set. However, it does run into issues and encounters with a lot of movement, since that AoE can drop and then the enemy can immediately move, and essentially you've wasted an 18-second period with very little damage on your 5-piece bonus. So this is something to keep in mind when you are deciding where to use this. It also has a unique interaction where if the enemy that it is applied to dies before the dot timer runs out, it will immediately drop the ground AoE. So that's something you can possibly coordinate around, maybe for certain short burst AoE situations. You do still have to wait for the full 18-second cooldown though, regardless. So this is one of my favorite sets to use when there is not a lot of movement and I want something that's very easy to proc and I don't have to think about it too much. Next up, we have kind of the opposite of don't have to think about it too much, and I'm going to put these two sets together here because they work very similarly, and those are Besides Mania, a light armor set from Rockgrove, and Coral Riptide, a medium armor set from Dreadsail Reef. Besides 5-piece bonus increases your damage based on your missing magicka, and Coral's 5-piece increases your weapon and spell damage based on your missing stamina. Both of these sets can be very strong. Besides a little bit better if you're wanting to run light armor for the penetration with your group, but Coral being a medium armor set can generally perform a little bit better for groups that are running armor debuffs like Alkosh. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the resource minigames you have to play with these sets, but I also can't deny how strong they are if you do want to participate in that micromanagement. It's also worth noting that Coral Riptide maxes out at 33% stamina remaining, which does give it a little more cushion to not have to be perfect with. So even at 60% stamina remaining, you're still getting a pretty nice bonus from the set, whereas 60% magicka with Besai is still under a 5% damage done boost. So Basai takes a bit more effort to get a good bonus, but it's also much less risky to keep your magicka low than it is to keep your stamina low. So that is the reason for the difference in the design there. Both of these are very strong options though, if that little mini game is something you're interested in playing around. Next up, something a little more my cup of tea and something I can turn my brain off for, we have Onsul's Torment. This is the new medium trial set from Sanity's Edge. Increases your damage done against monsters by 7%. Then when you interrupt an enemy, you can increase your damage done against monsters by another 7% for 10 seconds. So the condition here for that second half is a little bit strange for a trial set. You aren't going to really have much uptime on that for most trials encounters. However, the 7% by itself is actually pretty solid. Comparing that back to Basai, which we just talked about, that 7% would be about like keeping your magicka around 40% or so with that set, except this is a medium armor set and it's actually really nice to run for groups that are using armor debuffs like Alkosh or Crimson. It's just really solid overall as a set and forget kind of set where you don't have to do anything with it. You just have a very solid damage done bonus. Now there will be occasions that you benefit from the second portion of the 5-piece bonus. Some trials have mechanics where you're specifically having an interrupter assigned, and if you are doing solo or 4-person content, there's a lot higher chance you'll be the one getting those interrupts as opposed to 12-person content. So I think for certain encounters, this could actually be the best in slot damage option with that 14% bonus that you can get to. But for everything else, it's just really solid, and I'm definitely going to be using this one quite a bit for update 38. And then finally for this list, we have Mechanical Acuity. This is a craftable set from Clockwork City, and I think this one is another one that gets slept on a little bit, possibly just due to a lack of understanding of how this works exactly. So when you deal non-critical damage, you gain a stack of Mechanical Acuity for 4 seconds, granting you 20% crit strike chance per stack, up to once every 1 second, and stacking up to 5 times. So essentially what's happening is it stacks up your crit chance until you are only critically striking for 4 seconds, and then it drops off. So it doesn't matter if you're at 100% crit chance or not, or 92% crit chance or whatever. It just looks at if you are critting or not. So the key to this set is building for very low crit chance, often with infused on the pieces instead of divines, since divines will be boosting our Thief Mundus Stone, and swords instead of daggers for the weapon and spell damage instead of the crit chance. This is very strong for quickly bursting down enemies, especially if you have multiple people wearing it. Dropping Destra ults and having most of the ticks from those be critical strikes, just really juicy damage coming out of this set. Now, the big downside is that long 25-second cooldown on it. Obviously, this is not a good set for just a standard boss fight, as the downtime is far too high, and even as a trash DPS set for groups that are moving quickly through the ad packs, you likely won't be able to get off of the cooldown for each pack. So it is a very hyper-specialized sort of set, but if you use it the right way, it is incredibly effective. Now, obviously, depending on the types of content that you enjoy doing the most, your top 10 may look quite a bit different here, and there are a lot of other good sets that I wish I could have squeezed into this list, so here are just a few that didn't quite make that top 10. We have Yondir's Might, Elfbane, and Burning Spellweave. I really like all three of these sets a lot. Yondir has a nice consistent amount of weapon and spell damage, and the option to use a heavy attack to crank that up to 630 weapon and spell damage for 15 seconds. This can be super nice situationally. It works great as a front bar only set as well, and it's nice paired with proc sets since it will boost the damage of those. Elfbane is sort of in that same category as Mechanical Acuity. In fact, they're often even used together. It is a bit more niche, but can be really strong when boosting your Destro ultimate from 7 seconds up to 12 seconds. And then Burning Spellweave is a very popular option as a general use kind of set for short burst trash encounters. All right, for the next section of this video, I'm going to cover the top mythics for DPS. This will just be a general overview of my favorites. It won't be a guide for collecting these. There are plenty of those out there for the antiquity system. This will just be a rundown of which ones I commonly use and what types of situations I use them for. First up, we have the Harpooner's Wading Kilt. This is medium weight and is one of the strongest mythics in the game for damage at about 5% crit chance and 10% crit damage when you are at the full 10 stacks. And these stacks are easily built up by just dealing direct damage. Now, it does have the stipulation that you lose 5 stacks each time that you take direct damage, so there are definitely certain pieces of content that this will not work well on. Solo, it's pretty awful as you don't have a tank there to draw the attacks away from you. I also don't use it a lot in dungeons, as there tends to be a lot of random damage that you end up taking, especially true when pugging a dungeon, though there are certain fights where it still works well there. But really the most common place that you'll see the kilt is in trials. Many trial fights work really well with this as you take little to no direct damage as a DPS. That isn't always the case though. ESOresources.com has a nice kilt cheat sheet if you are interested in checking out the different trials and where the kilt might or might not work well. Next up, let's talk about the brand new mythic, Velothi Urmage's Amulet. This gives 1650 penetration. It adds a 15% damage done bonus to monsters. So this is a PvE only damage bonus. It adds in Minor Force, which is a 10% crit damage buff, and then it reduces your light and heavy attack damage by 99%. So to start off, for those that don't light attack weave very well, this should be a very nice mythic for you. Since you might not be dealing a very high percent of your damage from your light attacks anyways, getting that 15% damage done bonus is going to more than make up for that. However, for those that are more comfortable with light attack weaving, this will be a bit more situational. So let's run through some good uses for this mythic. For Arcanists, this is going to be a really great option as you're already not light attack weaving as often because of your Fate Carver beam, since that locks you into a channel for 4.5 to 5.5 seconds depending on the morph that you take. So as an Arcanist, you're already dealing less light attack damage than other classes would be, so giving up those to get the stats from this works really well. For other classes though, the way I'm looking at this is, for single target focused fights, generally my light attacks are doing a nice chunk of my damage. Let's just take this parse here on ESO logs. If we removed the light attack damage from the dual wield and two-hander light attacks and added back in the percent done bonus, you aren't really getting a very big increase, and generally you'd be better off with a different mythic such as the Kilt. However, for more AoE heavy encounters, since our light attacks will naturally deal a much smaller percent of our overall damage, losing those doesn't have nearly as big of an effect on us, so that 15% damage done increase looks a lot more appealing there. So definitely going to have this going in my AoE trash setups, and then also for bosses where the focus is more on AoE and less on just the main target, I think I'll likely use this on a number of those fights as well. And again, this is for all the non-Arcanist classes. I think for the Arcanist, it'll probably be pretty solid for pretty much all situations. The next mythic I really like is Mora's Whispers. This is a light shoulder piece and it gives about 7% increased crit chance and a bunch of XP bonuses based on how many books from Shalador's library you've collected. Now these are the books that you'll collect when you level the Mages Guild skill line, and in total there are 297 books spread across the different zones. So while the bonus on Mora's Whispers is very strong, it is quite a pain to farm, and it is a character-based progression, not account-based. So every character you want to use this on, you'll need to go collect all of the books for it. The other downside is that it is a shoulder piece, so there's no option to run it alongside of a two-piece monster set like you can with some of the other mythics. But this is definitely one that I try to use typically for situations where the kilt stacks are not kept up well, or I just want something easy to use that I don't really have to think about. There are no conditions or stacks or anything with this. You just get the bonus as long as you have done that initial book collection. All right, next up we have Ring of the Pale Order. This restores 20% of the damage you deal as health. This value is decreased by 4% per ally that you're grouped with. You cannot be healed by anyone but yourself. So this is generally best suited for solo play, and if you are dealing decent damage, it makes it so much easier to stay alive. And it can actually be pretty decent for damage as well, even though it doesn't have a damage bonus on it. Since you are healing based on your damage, you can spend more actions in combat focused on dealing damage rather than healing yourself. So this is just a really great option to get through those veteran solo arenas, and it makes Overland content, even the world bosses, a breeze to take down. Just be careful where you use it because it does diminish in power the larger your group size is, dropping to 0 in a group of 6 or more, and you cannot receive outside healing in any group size when you're wearing this. All right, next up is Oaken Soul. This is a ring that gives you a ton of different buffs, but it locks you into only being able to use one skill bar. So for 1-bar builds, this thing is really incredible. It adds a lot of damage and tankiness and is a must-have for the 1-bar heavy attack builds due to the permanent empower bonus that it gives, which increases your heavy attack damage by 70%. This mythic has really changed the way that the game can be played, and 1-bar setups are definitely viable now for all content in the game. Generally, with a high mastery level, you can outperform the 1-bar setups with the traditional 2-bar options, but for how much easier it is to go this route, the results you get here with Oaken Soul are very strong. Next up, we have Thracian Stranglers. These are light gloves. Every killing blow you land will give you a stack of 23 weapon and spell damage, and this can stack up to 50 times. So at 50 stacks, we're looking at 1150 weapon and spell damage, and that's before buffs, so that'll actually be quite a bit higher, which is just insane for a one-piece bonus. But we also end up with 6,000 lower health and 50% weaker shields. So there are a few things to discuss with this one. First off, as I mentioned, it does require landing the killing blow to get the stack. So that's why you don't commonly see this when run in trials, because you are essentially splitting all of those killing blows with your other group members, and even then the ad density is just not high enough to really make good use of this. For some arena content though, such as Maelstrom Arena or Black Rose Prison, and also in some dungeons, this is definitely doable. It's a bit riskier playstyle, but the damage is unmatched. If you can quickly get to those 50 stacks, you're going to be dealing a lot of damage. Unfortunately, the stacks do drop off for a number of different conditions. They'll fall off if you die, if you crouch or go invisible, or if you port to a different instance. So you can't carry the stacks with you into a piece of content. The stacks have to be built up in whatever zone you're working on. So this one is a bit more niche and more for high-end gameplay, but it can be really fun and strong if you can pull it off. And then finally, we have Sea Serpent's Coil. So there is that big snare on this ring. It can be a little bit annoying, but with some speed boosts like the Celerity, Champion Point Node, and Major Expedition, it really isn't too bad at all. Major Courage is also a pretty common group buff, so often when groups are coordinating around this mythic, they will drop their Major Courage set for something else. And the 10% damage done with Major Berserk is also pretty nice, though that is also a bit more redundant lately, as there are more and more ways to get this Major Berserk, especially now with the Sorcerer's Atronach giving Major Berserk to 12 people for 10 seconds at a time. So not as many uses for this set now, I don't think, but it still can be very strong if you are benefiting from both of those bonuses. So those are the more common ones that I use as a damage dealer. There are some other ones that you might consider, though I haven't really found myself using these lately as a DPS. Spalder of Ruin is a nice support option. Death Dealer's Fate gives you some tankiness and just some all-around stats. And then Mark and Ring of Majesty also gives you a little bit of offensive plus defensive power. Moving on to the final section in this video. If you made it this far, just want to say thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope it's been helpful so far. Now I'll cover the top ability altering weapons. Sometimes these are also referred to as arena weapons. So we'll start with the destruction staves. One of my favorites is the staff from Maelstrom Arena, aka Crushing Wall. This one's pretty straightforward, just boosts the damage that your wall deals by 1250. So this might seem a little low, but it's actually going to be buffed up by other percent modifiers in combat, so it ends up being quite a large boost to your wall of elements. This is okay in single target fights, but it really shines in AoE encounters, since Wall of Elements is a nice big AoE, and so you'll get that increased damage on everything that it's hitting. It doesn't really matter if you get the perfected version of this or not, as it's almost always a back bar weapon, so that added penetration will only be active while you're on your back bar. So if you just want to run on normal to pick this up, it's totally fine. You probably won't even really be able to tell a difference. You'll also generally want this as a flame staff for the highest DPS. Not really much else to say, just one of those must-have arena weapons. Next up for destruction staves, we have the Master's Staff, aka Destructive Impact. And this one comes from Dragonstar Arena. It reduces the cost of Destructive Touch by 10% and increases your weapon and spell damage by 600 for 4 seconds after activating it. This is really good on the Ice Staff for Magicka Wardens, since the initial hit on the Ice version of Destructive Reach is buffed up to be on par with a standard single target spammable, so you'll pretty much be running that and casting it all the time anyways, and with this staff you'll just get that 600 weapon and spell damage pretty much permanently. Outside of that, you can also sometimes see this used on lightning staves, as the lightning version of Destructive Clinch deals pretty nice AoE damage, which you can deal at full range. Typically melee options for AoE will be a bit stronger, but if you do want to play at range, this is a really nice option for AoE DPS. For the perfected versions of these, you do get some extra weapon and spell damage, which is pretty nice since these are typically run on your front bar, but Veteran Dragonstar Arena is not too difficult nowadays, as it is pretty old content, so don't feel too intimidated about going for the perfected versions. Moving on to the bows, first up we have the Master's Bow, Caustic Arrow. This one comes from Dragonstar Arena as well. This increases your weapon and spell damage by 330 against targets affected by your poison arrow, so this will commonly be kept up with poison injection. If you are going with a bow build, this is a really strong option as a backbar weapon for single target damage. However, if you do prefer to go for more AoE damage, you might want to go with the Maelstrom's Bow, Thunderous Volley. This one's pretty similar to the Maelstrom's Staff, except that you have a ramp up period instead of all of the extra damage just being equal for each tick. So this means you will miss out on a bit of that damage in more mobile encounters where you might not always get all of the ticks off. Still a pretty solid option for AoE damage if you are running a bow build. And then finally for the bows, we have the Black Rose Prison Arena Virulent Shot. So the dot from this thing ticks really hard, and it is one that's definitely best suited when you can get the longer duration from it. If you're up really close and only getting 4 seconds, it's kind of meh, but it is worth noting that some bosses with larger hitboxes, you may get a longer duration than you'd expect even when you are up close to them, because sometimes it calculates from their center point. So with a big boss, it might consider you being far away even if you feel like you're up pretty close to them. So maybe something you want to play around with and see which bosses it works well with. But if you can get your shots with this to last in that 10 to 12 second range, it is a really strong option. And I've seen people use this both as a front bar and a back bar weapon. All right, moving on to dual wield, we have the set from Black Rose Prison, Spectral Cloak. Dealing damage with Blade Cloak grants you Spectral Cloak for 2 seconds, reducing your damage taken and increasing your damage done by 6%. This is a really strong set. It can be used on the front bar or the back bar. The perfected bonus is just stamina recovery, so you aren't missing out on any damage from it if you just pick this up from normal Black Rose Prison. It's a really nice mix of stats on this to give both offensive and defensive power. Both morphs of Blade Cloak are just really nice to run anyways, and this is a really great weapon set overall. Next up for dual wield, from the Vodashran Hollows Arena, we have Executioner's Blade. So with this one, your Hidden Blade skill deals up to 250% more damage to targets under 100% health when you're standing behind them, and then you restore 1890 stamina if the target was below 50% health. This thing is really nice for stamina builds. It gives pretty much any class an execute option, but it also sort of condenses your spammable and execute into one skill. Typically, you'll run this with the Shrouded Daggers morph since it's a pretty nice AoE skill, but it won't start hitting too hard for single target damage until about 65 to 70% health remaining. It's also a pretty expensive skill, but that stamina cost refund that kicks in after 50% will be really noticeable if you can hang on with sustain until that point. But then after that, the thing starts hitting like a truck, and it only hits harder the lower the health the target gets to. So really the main downside is that you do have to be standing directly behind your target, and the range on that appears to be a good bit smaller than what you get from something like the Backstabber Champion Point node. So you really have to be lined up right behind your target. So it does kind of knock this one out for certain encounters, and definitely not too good for solo play since you're typically standing face to face with your targets. And the last dual wield set we'll talk about comes from Asylum Sanctorium. It is the Chaotic Whirlwind set. This gives you more damage based on how much move speed you have, and it also grants you more move speed when you use the Whirlwind skill. So essentially you need a 75% movement speed bonus total to max this thing out for the 450 weapon and spell damage. It's not something you'll probably come by naturally, but not super hard to reach either. With Major and Minor Expedition and the Celerity Point Champion node, you're going to be at 55%. So that plus 4 stacks from this set and you'll be at the full 450 weapon and spell damage. All right, let's move on to the two-hander sets. The first one is from Maelstrom Arena, Merciless Charge. This set is one of the sets in the Elder Scrolls Online. It's just kind of one of those that fills in a back bar spot, but it really doesn't do a ton of damage for PvE DPS. Feels quite a bit lacking compared to what the Maelstrom Staff and the Bow add to those respective abilities. Stampede is a really good ability on its own, so you can still get some good results using this set, but there's a reason you often see people backbarring a 5-piece set whenever they're using a two-handed weapon on the back bar. Definitely wouldn't say that this is a priority to pick up, but it can fill in some gaps for certain builds. And then finally, we have the Masters two-hander Titanic Cleave. This comes from Dragonstar Arena. Increases the direct damage cleave deals by 1550 for each enemy in the cone. So this will work for either Carve or Brawler, whichever morph you have. For small ad packs, typically this is just okay, but when you start seeing 4 or 5 plus enemies grouped together, this thing really starts to shine, and it keeps going up the more enemies are stacked up. So for really dense packs, it can be the strongest option for AoE DPS. It's also just kind of nice when you're using Carve or Brawler as a spammable, since you keep refreshing that shield on yourself. So not only a really strong AoE spammable with this set, but you're getting extra defensive as well. I think this set is probably worthy of a lot more use than it typically gets. Now, there are some other good arena sets that you could use for PvE DPS as well and still get good results, but I think the ones that I just went through will be the most common, and the other ones, I don't really think they add anything special to the damage dealing role that you can't get somewhere else. Well, that's it. that's the video. I know this one was pretty long, but the idea was that this would serve as an all-in-one sort of guide for the different types of gear in the Elder Scrolls Online. Whether you're a new player or a veteran, this can be a reference for you when figuring out different options to collect to get the most out of your character as a damage dealer. And again, as a reminder, I already did a monster set video, so that one is separate, and I have it linked at the top of the description. But thank you so much for watching. Let me know if I left off any sets that you really love using. There are definitely plenty of other good options. With this video already being as long as it is, you can see how it would be tough to try to really go through every single option, but hopefully this gave you a nice foundation to work from. Big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. The contributions really help a ton to keep the website and YouTube channel going. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Iffy, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Vadridi, Florian, Phoenix, Nalandia, Unemployed, Chryseliana, Cha-Cha, and Technical KO. Thank you again and see you later. Bye.